December 18, 1944. The Bavarian Alps. Staff Sergeant Frank Romano dangled from silk parachute lines, watching his burning B-17 bomber spiral toward the snow-covered mountains below. The 23-year-old bombardier from Brooklyn had approximately 90 seconds before he hit German soil, 90 seconds before his war changed completely. He'd been briefed on what to expect. Immediate capture by Wehrmacht patrols, interrogation at Dulag Luft, transfer to a POW camp. Standard procedure for downed American airmen. What he couldn't have imagined, what no intelligence briefing could have prepared him for, was that his parachute would carry him not into the hands of German soldiers, but into a story of impossible mercy that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the enemy. The wind carried Romano east, away from his crew's planned bailout zone. Below, the landscape transformed from military installations and towns into something far more isolated. Endless white forests, steep valleys, and scattered farmsteads that looked like toys from his altitude. His training screamed at him to steer toward population centers where he might link up with other downed airmen or resistance contacts. Instead, the December gale had other plans. He crashed through pine branches, the impact stealing his breath, before slamming into a snowdrift so deep it swallowed him to his chest. For several minutes, Romano simply lay there listening. No dogs barking, no shouts in German, no rumble of military vehicles, just wind through trees and the distant sound of cowbells. He'd landed in the middle of nowhere. Working quickly despite frozen fingers, he buried his parachute under snow and checked his survival kit. Compass, emergency rations, a phrase book he'd barely studied. His service pistol had been lost in the descent. As the adrenaline faded, reality set in. He was alone, unarmed in the heart of Nazi Germany, wearing a flight suit that screamed American airman to anyone who saw him. The temperature was dropping fast. Through the trees, perhaps half a mile down the slope, he spotted smoke rising from a chimney. A farmhouse. Romano's training said avoid all German civilians, but hypothermia didn't care about training protocols. As darkness fell and the cold began to truly bite, he made his decision. He would approach the farm under cover of night, steal what he could, food, civilian clothes, and disappear into the mountains. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan he had. The farm appeared even more isolated up close. A single two-story house with weathered wood siding, a large barn, and a small stable. No electrical lines. No telephone poles. This was subsistence farming at its most basic. Romano circled the property twice, watching for movement. Through a window, he saw lamplight and a woman's silhouette moving in the kitchen. No men, no soldiers. Just one woman in what appeared to be an empty house. He was creeping toward the barn, hoping to find shelter for the night, when his boot cracked a frozen branch. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the still air. The kitchen door flew open. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a lamp high. She called out something in German, her voice sharp with alarm. Romano froze, hands raised, his mind racing through the few German phrases he knew. Before he could speak, the woman stepped into the yard, and the lamplight revealed her face. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held a wariness Romano recognized. He'd seen that same look on his mother's face during the Depression, the expression of someone who'd learned not to trust easy things. She stared at him, taking in his flight suit, his American insignia, his obvious foreignness. Then she did something that made no sense. She glanced quickly toward the road, toward where neighbors or patrols might appear, and gestured urgently toward the barn. Not a threatening gesture, an invitation, or a command. Romano didn't move. This had to be a trap. She gestured again, more frantically this time, and hissed something in German that needed no translation. Hurry. Against every instinct, Romano ran for the barn. The woman followed, closing the heavy door behind them. In the darkness he heard her moving, then the scratch of a match. Lamplight revealed a typical dairy barn, 4 cows in stalls, hay bales stacked to the rafters, the warm smell of animals and manure. The woman pointed upward to the hayloft and made a hiding gesture. Then she pressed a finger to her lips. Silence. She left him there, in the dark, in the barn of a German farm, with no explanation and no guarantee she wasn't already running to alert the authorities. Romano climbed into the hayloft and burrowed into the hay, his service training warring with exhaustion. He should run. He should escape while he still could. But the cold, the darkness, and the sheer improbability of what had just happened kept him frozen in place. He would wait until morning. Then he would decide. Morning came with the sound of the barn door opening and small footsteps on the floor below. Romano peered through the hay to see a little girl, perhaps 5 years old, entering with a small bucket. She sang softly to herself as she scattered feed for the chickens he hadn't noticed in the darkness. She was maybe 10 feet below his hiding spot, completely unaware that an enemy airman was watching her morning routine. The innocence of the scene struck Romano with unexpected force. This child, this German child, looked exactly like his niece back in Brooklyn. Same dark curls, same unself-conscious movements of a kid who thought the world was safe. The girl finished her chores and skipped out, still singing. Minutes later, the woman returned. She carried a wooden bowl covered with a cloth and a ceramic jug. She climbed the ladder to the loft, moving with the confidence of someone who'd made this climb thousands of times. Up close, Romano could see the lines around her eyes, the roughness of her hands, the black armband on her sleeve. A widow. She was a war widow. She set down the bowl and jug, uncovering warm porridge and milk. Real food. Then she spoke slowly and clearly in broken English that surprised them both. "My name Anna." She must have been practicing the phrase. Romano found his voice. "Frank, I'm Frank. American." She nodded as if this was obvious and pointed to the bowl. "Eat, you stay here, safe." The words were simple, but the implications were staggering. She wasn't just offering him a meal. She was offering him sanctuary. In Nazi Germany, where hiding an enemy combatant meant execution. Romano tried to explain, to tell her the danger she was courting, but his German was worse than her English. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" Anna's face clouded. She touched the black armband, then pointed east. "Stalingrad. My husband, dead." She paused, searching for words. "War is," she struggled with the English, "war is wrong, all wrong." Then she descended the ladder and left him alone with food that tasted like salvation, and a mystery that would take months to unravel. The routine established itself with surprising speed. Anna would come to the barn 3 times daily, ostensibly to tend the cows, always bringing food hidden under her apron. Romano learned to time his movements to hers, to stay absolutely silent when anyone else was near. The daughter, whose name was Greta, came every morning to feed the chickens, never knowing that an American was hiding 15 feet above her head. The first week was the hardest. Romano's body ached from the cramped conditions and the cold that seeped through even the thick hay. His mind raced with paranoia. Every sound outside the barn might be soldiers. Every voice might be the one that ended this impossible sanctuary. But Anna was careful, almost methodically so. She varied her times coming to the barn. She never stayed long enough to arouse suspicion. and she began, slowly, to teach him the rhythms of the farm, the sounds that meant danger and the sounds that meant safety. Through broken conversations, pieced together from her limited English and his terrible German, with generous use of hand gestures and drawings in the dirt floor, Romano began to understand his benefactor. Anna had been married at 19 to Klaus, a dairy farmer 12 years her senior. They'd had Greta, built a modest life in these mountains. Then the war came. Klaus had been drafted in 1942, sent to the Eastern Front, and died in the hell of Stalingrad in early 1943. She'd been alone ever since, running the farm, raising Greta, surviving. The Nazi authorities had left her largely alone. The farm was too small and remote to be worth much attention, and widows of fallen soldiers were given a measure of sympathy, provided they didn't cause trouble. But hiding an American airman, that was trouble beyond measure. Romano asked her again, more directly this time with the help of his phrase book, why she was risking everything. Anna's answer came in pieces over several days as her English improved and his German became less catastrophic. She told him about receiving the telegram about Klaus, about the Nazi officer who delivered it, speaking of honor and sacrifice and the glory of the Reich. She'd wanted to spit in his face. Her husband hadn't died for glory. He died frozen in a trench, probably screaming for help that never came, in a war that had already taken too many men from their village. She told him about her brother Heinrich, who served in a Luftwaffe flak unit. Heinrich had been home on leave just 2 months earlier, in October. He'd gotten drunk on schnapps one night and confessed something to Anna that he couldn't tell anyone else. His unit had shot down an American bomber near Munich. The plane had been crippled, clearly trying to make it back to Allied lines, when they'd hit it with their 88mm guns. Heinrich had watched through binoculars as the bomber broke apart. He'd seen parachutes, but only 3. The rest of the crew had gone down with the plane. For weeks afterward, Heinrich told her he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing those parachutes, kept counting the ones that didn't open. He'd been trained to see American bombers as terror weapons, their crews as war criminals deliberately targeting German civilians. But through those binoculars, he'd seen men, just men trying to survive. The story had shaken Anna. Her brother, who'd always been gentle, who'd cried when their father died, had become a killer. Not because he was evil, but because the war had made killing necessary. And somewhere in America, she realized, there were 3 families who would get telegrams just like hers. 3 women who would become widows. 3 sets of children who would grow up without fathers. The cycle of grief was endless. When Romano had literally fallen from the sky onto her property, Anna had faced a choice. She could follow the law, turn him in, and he would disappear into the POW system. Or she could do something that made no strategic sense, that offered no benefit to her or her country, that violated every rule of the society she lived in. She could choose mercy, not because Americans deserved it, not because she thought it would change anything about the war, but because she was tired of grief, tired of death, tired of the machinery that turned men into corpses and wives into widows. Saving one life wouldn't stop the war, but it would mean that, for once, the war didn't win. Romano listened to this explanation, delivered in halting English over the course of many conversations, and felt something shift in his understanding of the enemy. He'd been trained to see Germans as either fanatics or cowards, believers in Nazi ideology or too weak to resist it. Anna was neither. She was simply a woman who'd lost too much and decided that one life, even an enemy life, was worth saving. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Romano's bombing missions had targeted German cities, German factories, German infrastructure. He'd released bombs over Munich, Stuttgart, Nuremberg. He'd done his job professionally, without hatred, but also without much thought for who might be below. Now he was dependent on the mercy of someone whose country he'd been actively trying to destroy. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. January brought new dangers. The Battle of the Bulge had intensified, and German authorities were increasingly paranoid about spies and saboteurs. A Nazi official visited the farm, ostensibly checking on agricultural production quotas. Anna had hidden Romano under a false floor she'd hastily constructed in the hayloft, covering it with loose hay. He'd lain there for 3 hours, barely breathing, while the official walked through the barn, commenting on the condition of the cows. Greta had been there too, chattering away about her chickens, her innocent voice providing cover for the deception happening feet away. After the official left, Anna had climbed to the loft, her hands shaking. "Too close," she whispered. "Too close." But she didn't ask Romano to leave. Instead, she improved his hiding place, creating a more sophisticated concealment that could withstand a thorough search. She brought him a German civilian coat and hat, items that had belonged to Klaus, in case he needed to run. And she began teaching him more German, practical phrases that might save his life if he had to flee. The winter deepened. Romano's existence became a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor free man. He was utterly dependent on Anna's continued courage, and he was acutely aware that every day she sheltered him was another day she risked execution. He tried to make himself useful, helping with small repairs in the barn that he could do silently, braiding rope from hay, anything to feel less like a burden. He also began to understand the cost of Anna's choice in ways that went beyond physical danger. The farm was struggling. Food was scarce across Germany, and Anna's rations were calculated for 2 people, herself and Greta. Now she was feeding 3. She gave Romano portions of her own meals, and he watched her grow thinner. When he protested, she was adamant. "You are soldier, you need strength, I am fine." But she wasn't fine. None of them were fine. They were all just surviving day by day in a situation that couldn't last. In February, Heinrich came home on leave again. Romano spent 2 terrifying days under the false floor while Anna's brother stayed at the house. He could hear Heinrich's voice through the barn walls, hear him playing with Greta, hear the sounds of a family trying to pretend the war wasn't destroying everything they knew. On the second night, Romano heard shouting. Heinrich and Anna were arguing about something, their voices carrying from the house. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Anger, frustration, fear. The next morning, Anna came to the barn with red eyes. She'd been crying. Romano asked what had happened, and she explained, haltingly, that Heinrich had received new orders. He was being sent to defend Berlin. Everyone knew what that meant. The Soviets were coming from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Berlin would be the final battle, and it would be a slaughter. Heinrich didn't expect to survive. Anna had begged him to desert, to hide, to run to Switzerland. He'd refused. Not because he believed in the Nazi cause anymore. He'd stopped believing months ago, but because desertion meant execution, and that execution would extend to his family. If he ran, Anna and Greta would pay the price. So he would go to Berlin, and he would probably die because the machinery of war gave him no other choice. After telling Romano this, Anna looked at him with an expression he would never forget. "You see," she said, "we are all prisoners. You in my barn, me in my country, Heinrich in his uniform. The war makes prisoners of everyone." March brought the sound of distant artillery. The Western Front was collapsing, and Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany. Romano could hear the rumble of heavy guns, sometimes see the glow of fires on the horizon. Liberation was coming, but it was coming slowly, and every day that passed increased the danger. German military units, retreating eastward, began using the road that passed near Anna's farm. Twice, soldiers stopped to requisition food. Anna gave them what she could spare, which was almost nothing, and they left without searching the barn. But it was only a matter of time before someone decided to be thorough. Romano and Anna developed an emergency plan. If soldiers came to search the barn, Romano would slip out the back into the forest and make for a cave Anna had shown him on a map. He would wait there for 3 days. If Anna didn't come for him by then, he would assume she'd been arrested and would try to reach Allied lines on his own. They both knew the plan was desperate and unlikely to work, but it was better than nothing. In early April, Anna came to the barn in the middle of the night, something she'd never done before. Romano jerked awake, instantly alert, thinking the worst had happened. Instead, Anna was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time since he'd met her. She held a small radio, a forbidden item she'd kept hidden. The Americans, she said, her English suddenly more fluent in her excitement. The Americans are in Stuttgart. Maybe 1 week, maybe 2, they come here. Romano felt a surge of hope so intense it was almost painful. 1 week, 2 weeks. He'd been in this barn for almost 5 months. He could survive 2 more weeks, but Anna's expression shifted, the smile fading. She had something else to tell him, something she'd been holding back. She sat on a hay bale, and Romano sat across from her, and she told him the real reason she'd chosen to save him. Back in 1943, shortly after Klaus had died, Anna had been in a dark place. Grief-stricken, alone, responsible for a small child and a failing farm, she'd seriously considered ending her life. The only thing that stopped her was Greta. She couldn't leave her daughter alone in the world. One night, at her lowest point, she'd prayed. Anna wasn't particularly religious. The war had burned away most of her faith, but she'd prayed anyway. She'd asked God, or the universe, or whatever might be listening, for a sign that there was still goodness in the world, still some reason to keep fighting. She'd asked for proof that mercy still existed, that the war hadn't killed every decent impulse in humanity. Nothing had happened. No sign came. Life continued in its grinding, miserable way. Until December 18, 1944, when an American bombardier fell from the sky onto her property. Anna told Romano that when she'd seen him in her yard, frightened and lost and clearly expecting to be turned in, she'd realized something. The sign she'd prayed for wasn't going to come from outside. It had to come from her. She had to be the mercy she'd asked to see in the world. Saving Romano wasn't about him. Not really. It was about proving to herself that she was still human, still capable of choosing compassion over hate, still able to resist the dehumanization the war demanded. If she could save one enemy, one person she had every reason to hate, then maybe there was hope. Maybe the world wasn't completely broken. Romano listened to this confession with tears running down his face. He'd spent 5 months thinking Anna was some kind of saint, impossibly brave and selfless. The truth was more complex and more beautiful. She was just a broken person trying to fix herself by fixing something in the world. She was choosing mercy not because it was easy, but because it was the only way she knew to stay sane. On April 22, 1945, the sound of American tanks reached the farm. Romano heard them before he saw them, the distinctive rumble of Sherman engines, the clank of treads on the road. He climbed down from the loft for the first time in months, his legs weak from disuse, and stood in the barn doorway. Anna stood beside him, with Greta holding her hand. The little girl still didn't know who Romano was. Anna had told her he was a distant relative hiding from the Nazis, which was true enough. Together, they watched as a column of American armor rolled past, heading east toward the remnants of German resistance. Romano wanted to run to them, to shout, to wave his arms. But he stayed still, watching until Anna touched his arm. "Go," she said simply. "Go home." Romano turned to her, this woman who'd saved his life at incredible risk, and realized he had no words adequate to the moment. "Thank you" felt impossibly small. Anna seemed to understand. She squeezed his hand once, then gently pushed him toward the road. Romano walked out of the barn into the spring sunlight and flagged down an American jeep. The soldiers were shocked to find a bombardier who'd been missing for 4 months, shocked even more by his story. They wanted to arrest Anna immediately, standard procedure for German civilians who'd had contact with Allied personnel. Romano refused to let them. He explained, insisted, nearly got into a physical altercation with a lieutenant before a captain intervened. Anna had saved his life. She'd risked everything. She would not be punished for that. The captain, a weary man who'd seen too much war, looked at Romano, then at Anna standing in her farmyard with her daughter, then back at Romano. He made a decision that probably violated several regulations. He took down Anna's information, marked her as a friendly contact, and moved on. There were bigger battles to fight. Romano was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a processing center, then finally home to Brooklyn. He spent weeks being debriefed, telling his story over and over to intelligence officers who couldn't quite believe it. A German war widow hiding an American bombardier for 5 months. It was the kind of story that seemed too neat, too convenient, but it was true, and eventually the army accepted it. In the chaos of post-war Germany, Romano lost track of Anna. The letters he sent to the farm went unanswered. He didn't know if she'd survived the final days of the war, if she and Greta had made it through the occupation, if they'd been punished for helping him despite his protests. It would be 3 years before he got an answer. In 1948, through the Red Cross and a lot of persistent inquiries, Romano finally made contact. Anna and Greta had survived. They were still on the farm, still struggling but alive. Heinrich had not been so lucky. He died in the defense of Berlin just as he'd expected. Anna's letter, translated from German, was brief and matter-of-fact. She was glad Romano had made it home safely. She hoped he was well. She asked him not to feel guilty about what she'd done. It had been her choice, and she would make it again. Romano wrote back immediately. He sent packages through relief organizations. Food, clothing, small luxuries that were impossible to find in occupied Germany. He sent photos of his family, of the niece who looked like Greta, of his life in Brooklyn. And he sent a letter explaining something he'd realized in the years since the war. Anna had saved more than his life. She'd saved his faith in humanity. After months of dropping bombs on German cities, after being trained to see the enemy as something less than human, Romano had been on the verge of becoming exactly the kind of person the war wanted him to be. Someone who could kill without feeling, who could reduce complex human beings to acceptable casualties. Anna had shown him that the enemy was just people, flawed and frightened, and trying to survive, capable of extraordinary courage and mercy. She'd taught him that even in the middle of mechanized death, individual choices still mattered. One person choosing compassion over hate couldn't stop a war, but it could save a soul, maybe two souls, and prove that the machinery of violence hadn't won completely. The correspondence continued for years. Romano never returned to Germany. The memories were too complicated, but he and Anna maintained a connection that transcended the war that had brought them together. When Greta got married in 1959, Romano sent a gift. When Anna died in 1967, he mourned her as deeply as he'd mourned his own mother. In his later years, Romano would tell his story to schools, to veterans groups, to anyone who would listen. He always emphasized the same point. Anna wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. She hadn't fought battles or changed the course of history. She'd simply chosen mercy when hate would have been easier and safer. But that choice, that small act of defiance against the logic of war, had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. Romano had returned from the war determined to build rather than destroy. He'd become a teacher, working with immigrant children in Brooklyn, trying to pass on the lesson Anna had taught him. That our common humanity is stronger than the forces that try to divide us. He'd raised his children to question authority, to resist dehumanization, to see the person behind the label of enemy. And he'd told Anna's story over and over, until it became a small legend in certain circles. A reminder that even in the darkest times, individuals can choose light. The story of Frank Romano and Anna raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of war and loyalty, about what we owe to our enemies and what we owe to our own humanity. Anna had every reason to hate Americans. Her husband had died fighting them indirectly. Her brother had shot down their planes. Her country was being destroyed by their bombs. By every measure of wartime logic, she should have turned Romano in without hesitation. But she'd chosen a different path, one that acknowledged that the young man in her barn was not responsible for her grief, that punishing him wouldn't bring Klaus back, that adding to the world's suffering wouldn't reduce her own. It was a choice that made no strategic sense but perfect human sense. And it was a choice that thousands of people made during the war, on all sides, in small ways that history rarely records. The German families who left food out for escaped POWs, the Japanese civilians who hid down American airmen, the Italian villagers who sheltered Allied soldiers. These acts of mercy didn't change the outcome of the war, but they changed the people involved, both the givers and receivers of compassion. They were proof that war, for all its power to corrupt and destroy, couldn't completely erase the human capacity for kindness. Romano's story also highlights a painful irony that many veterans struggle with, the realization that the enemy is not so different from themselves. Romano had flown bombing missions believing he was fighting pure evil, that the destruction he rained down was justified by the righteousness of the Allied cause. Meeting Anna forced him to confront a more complex reality. The people below weren't all Nazis. Many were just trying to survive a war they didn't start and couldn't stop. This realization didn't make Romano regret his service or question the necessity of defeating Nazi Germany, but it complicated his understanding of what he'd done, added moral weight to actions he'd once performed with clear conscience. In his later years, he would say that Anna had given him two gifts, his life and the burden of recognizing the cost of war in human terms. Both gifts were necessary. Both gifts were painful. The barn where Romano hid for 5 months still stands, though the farm has changed hands several times since Anna's death. There's no plaque, no marker indicating what happened there. To the casual observer, it's just an old barn in the Bavarian Alps, weathered by time and unremarkable. But for those who know the story, it represents something profound. a small space where, for a few months in 1945, the logic of war was suspended, and two people from opposite sides of a conflict found common ground in their shared humanity. It's a reminder that history is not just made by generals and politicians, by grand strategies and decisive battles. It's also made by individual choices, by moments of courage or cowardice, mercy or cruelty, that ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. Anna's decision to hide Frank Romano changed two lives directly, but through Romano's decades of teaching and storytelling, it touched thousands more, each person who heard the story and took from it a lesson about the power of individual moral choice. The war ended more than 75 years ago. The generation that fought it is nearly gone, but the lessons remain, encoded in stories like Romano's, waiting to be discovered by new generations facing their own moral challenges. In a world that still produces wars, that still encourages us to see others as enemies to be destroyed rather than people to be understood, Anna's choice stands as a quiet rebuke to the logic of violence. She couldn't stop the war. She couldn't save everyone. But she could save one person, and she could prove, if only to herself, that mercy was still possible, that the war hadn't won completely, that some part of human decency could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do, make the choice in front of us, act with whatever courage and compassion we can muster, and hope that our small acts of defiance against hatred add up to something larger. Frank Romano lived until 1998, dying at the age of 77. In his final years, he established a small scholarship fund for German exchange students studying in America, a last gesture of gratitude to the woman who'd saved him, and a final affirmation of the lesson she'd taught. That our common humanity transcends national boundaries, that mercy is always possible, and that individual choices matter, even when the world is on fire. Anna's story and Romano's remind us that war is not just about nations and ideologies clashing. It's about individual human beings making impossible choices under unbearable pressure. Some choose hate. Some choose survival at any cost. And some, like Anna, choose mercy, even when mercy makes no sense, even when it offers no advantage, simply because they refuse to let the war destroy their humanity. Those are the stories we need to remember. Those are the choices we need to honor, because they prove that even in the darkest times, even when the machinery of violence seems unstoppable, individual human beings can still choose light. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.